The flight deck stretched out beneath the deepening twilight, its painted lines glinting under the steady glow of sodium lights. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and the faint tang of salt blown in from the Pacific. Elena Carter stood near the No. 2 catapult, helmet cradled under one arm. The call sign Falcon stenciled in black on its side. Her jet sat ready, tied down and connected to deck power. But tonight she would not be in the launch rotation. She had been grounded from the night strike for what the operations officer had called insufficient after-dark flight hours. The words delivered in the casual tone of a checklist item. It was not an insult. Not exactly, but it carried the same finality. The ready room earlier had been crowded with pilots suiting up for the strike. The hiss of oxygen bottles and the soft crack of gloves being pulled on, filling the space. A few glanced her way with a mix of sympathy and mild amusement. One of the junior lieutenants offered a half-hearted, "You'll get your turn," before turning back to his pre-flight tablet. Her commanding officer had paused only long enough to remind her that standing alert on the deck was still an important role. The words were procedural, without weight. She had nodded and said nothing. Now, as the first of the strike aircraft roared off the deck, afterburners flaring against the night, she kept her gaze on the horizon. The black ocean spread endlessly ahead, its surface invisible beyond the shimmering line of deck lights. Those lights reflected faintly in her visor when she lowered it, the last barrier between her and the dark. She adjusted the comms in her ear, listening to the layered chatter of the strike group climbing out and the calm responses from the carrier's Combat Information Center. Her role tonight was to monitor from the deck, ready to launch if the returning wave needed support. She checked her own displays out of habit. The radar was quiet, except for the rhythmic sweep of the beam and a few distant commercial transponder returns. Then, almost buried in the background, she caught a faint blip to the northwest. It was a soft, transient echo, the kind that could be anything from weather interference to a signal ghost. She tagged it on her display and reported it up the line. The reply came back in a flat voice that it was likely a false return. She acknowledged the call and logged the mark anyway, the habit of precision too ingrained to let it pass. The deck rumbled beneath her boots as another aircraft slammed onto the No. 3 wire behind her. She didn't flinch, her attention fixed on the quiet sweep of the radar. The blip did not return immediately, but she noted its bearing and time in her kneeboard. Around here, the crew moved with the practiced choreography of launch and recovery, shouts and hand signals passing between them in the harsh white of the floodlights. She stood still, a figure half invisible in the background bustle. When her shift rotated through, she stayed by the aircraft, helmet now on, and strapped. She glanced down the length of the deck, catching the faint shimmer of heat rising from the catapult track. Out beyond it, the ocean was a black wall, unbroken and silent. In that darkness was risk, and she knew it. The carrier's lights were the last anchor to safety, and she would not be surprised when the night came to demand more than the plan allowed. She checked her watch, logged another cycle in the radar, and settled into her post. Others might see her as a spare part tonight, a body filling a slot. But she had learned long ago that being overlooked meant having the freedom to notice the things no one else did. That was often where the difference began, long before anyone realized there was one to make. The flight deck vibrated under Elena Carter's boots as a fully loaded strike jet thundered down the catapult beside her and disappeared into the night. She stood just behind her own A-18, canopy closed, power systems live, tethered to the catapult, yet still waiting for clearance that would almost certainly never come. The metallic tang of the deck, mixed with the sharp scent of fuel and the faint spray of salt carried up from the black water far below. Through her helmet, the steady background hum of carrier operations layered with bursts of comm chatter in her ear, each voice clipped and precise. Her radar scope glowed in the cockpit, the sweep arm making its slow, unbroken rotation. Most returns were benign commercial transponders, Routine air traffic far from the strike zone, but she had trained herself to watch the sweep as if it were a living thing. The radar pings were steady, measured, and in her mind, they took on the slow rhythm of a heartbeat. Every 4 seconds it pulsed, each sweep another breath. Another quiet reminder that the night was not empty. The deck around her moved with constant energy. Launch crew sprinted between tie-down chains and chocks, signaling pilots to advance throttles. Handlers shifted aircraft into position with practiced precision. The floodlights painting everything in harsh, white, and deep shadow. From where she sat, Elena was both in the middle of it and completely apart. Her role was to be ready. Nothing more. And no one was looking her way. A faint contact blinked into life on her scope. Far to the northwest. She leaned closer, adjusting the gain to strip away background clutter. It faded, then returned 2 sweeps later. Faint, but moving. She marked it, sending the track to Combat Information Center. Their reply came a moment later, flat and uninterested, advising that it was likely a false return and she should maintain alert status. The contact vanished again. She logged the bearing, range, and time in her kneeboard without comment. Another launch rattled the deck plates beneath her. The shock running up her legs and into the frame of the jet. She glanced back toward the island's superstructure, where yellow-shirted handlers moved under the shadows of the mast. The contrast was sharp over there. Orders were given and executed instantly. Each man and woman, part of an unbroken chain. Out here in the cockpit, she was her own link. Watching a picture no one else cared to study closely. Minitus stretched. She shifted her grip on the control stick, adjusting a dial on the radar to pull in more distant returns. The scope's sweep remained steady, but every few rotations she thought she saw the faintest disturbance. It was like hearing something in the distance and knowing you might be the only one to notice. The headset crackled again with CIC reports on the main strike group's position and fuel states. Elena answered only when required, her voice calm, clipped, betraying nothing of the way she was beginning to map the northwest contact's possible approach vector in her head. She traced it mentally, overlaying it against the carrier group's own movements, and knew that if it was real, it would not stay alone. Around her, the night deck surged with energy, but inside the cockpit there was only the heartbeat of the radar. She understood her place tonight, understood that she was considered a reserve asset at best. That did not change the fact that she was the only one watching this sweep as closely as it deserved. She had no authority to act on it now, but she would remember every bearing, every pulse. If the night turned, she would be ready to move before anyone told her to. The contact returned to Elena Carter's radar, sharper now. No longer a faint echo that could be dismissed as interference. It was moving fast and low, closing the distance in a way that set her instincts on edge. She adjusted the radar scale, bringing the sweep in tighter, and watched as one contact became several. Within 2 rotations, she counted at least 6, all holding formation, all headed directly toward the carrier group. The dim red lighting along the deck cast long shadows across her canopy frame. In her headset, the routine traffic of carrier operations hummed on, punctuated by occasional calls from the returning strike group. She keyed her mic, reporting the contacts and their speed, and requested immediate clearance to launch. The reply came back clipped from Combat Information Center, confirming receipt but advising her to remain on standby until further notice. She tightened her grip on the throttle and repeated the range figures, this time adding that the combat air patrol was too far out to intercept before the formation reached them. Her request climbed the chain, the seconds stretching as she watched the bearing remain constant. The reply, when it came, was final. Stand down. The cap would handle it. She swallowed her response and looked out across the deck, the deck lights glowing faintly in her visor. The carrier engines thrummed through the airframe, a steady vibration under her boots. Another sweep of the radar showed the formation beginning to split. She watched the contacts spread into two elements, one holding the original heading, another bending off to the west. It was the kind of maneuver that suggested a pincer approach, boxing the carrier group between two attack angles. She sent the update to CIC, her voice steady despite the heat building behind her ribs. The answer came back, the same: continue monitoring. The air boss's voice cut into her channel, calm but edged with authority. He reminded her that breaking protocol would end her career. You break protocol tonight, he said. You're done flying for good. She acknowledged the warning, eyes still on the radar scope. The numbers were unambiguous, closing fast. Separation shrinking. The range now less than 70 nautical miles. From somewhere aft came the distant roar of another jet launching. The sound fading into the night. She tilted her visor slightly toward the catapult ahead of her, catching the reflection of the deck lights one more time. That glow was the last line of safety she would see if she went airborne. The rest of the night would be nothing but ocean, darkness, and hostile radar locks. Her fingers flexed on the stick as she ran the scenario in her head. She could wait for the cap to return. I hope the intercept was clean. I hope the pincer didn't close before they arrived. Or she could act now, burn what little margin she had left with the command, and meet the threat before it reached the carrier. The chain of command wanted order. Her instincts told her speed was the only chance they had. The formation crept closer on her scope, each sweep of the radar like a heartbeat counting down. She kept her voice level as she sent one more update, knowing the answer before it came. When it did, she let the channel fall silent and looked again toward the horizon. The black ocean invisible beyond the deck, somewhere out there. The night was moving toward them, and she was the only one watching it arrive. Elena Carter had heard the warning from the air boss only minutes ago, but the radar picture in front of her left no space for hesitation. The formation was closing fast, the split elements moving in a way that would force the carrier into a two-front defense. Waiting meant gambling with minutes. She did not believe they had. She steadied her breathing, glanced once at the catapult crew standing by, and began running through a rapid systems check without requesting clearance. Her hands moved with precise economy, fuel state, weapon systems armed, hydraulics in the green, avionics cycling clean. Every step was muscle memory. Each switch flipped a quiet acknowledgement that the decision was already made. She eased the throttle forward to bring the engines to military power, the rising whine vibrating through the airframe. The launch crew noticed the change immediately. The yellow-shirted director raised a hand, hesitant, his body language asking the question without speaking it. She met his eyes through the canopy, visor down, and gave a single sharp hand signal forward. The deck lights reflected off her visor, masking everything but the firmness in her posture. The catapult officer hesitated, glancing toward the tower, listening for the call that would not come. For a moment, the night seemed to hold its breath. Then he gave a short, almost resigned nod, stepped back, and returned her salute. The final lock engaged on the nose gear shuttle. She pushed the throttles past the detent into afterburner, feeling the engines surge with a deep, physical roar. The deck shuddered beneath her as the catapult fired, the acceleration slamming her into the seat. Twin lances of fire tore into the night behind her, their glow painting the deck crew in orange for a fraction of a second. The carrier's lights dropped away fast, swallowed by the black ocean until they were no more than pinpricks in the distance. The sudden quiet of the cockpit replaced the noise of the deck, leaving only the steady hum of the systems and her breathing inside the helmet. She brought the nose up, scanning instruments by instinct, cross-checking altitude and speed against the launch profile. The horizon was a featureless void. Her only frame of reference, the glowing symbology on the heads-up display. The radar sweep began its rotation again. The hostile formation still there, still closing. She made a small adjustment to the throttle, balancing speed with fuel conservation. her mind calculating the distance to intercept. In the space between actions, her thoughts slid to the reality she had just stepped into. Breaking protocol was not a minor infraction. This was the kind of decision that could end her career, strip her of her wings, and see her off the flight line for good. But the alternative, sitting on the deck, waiting for the cap to return while the carrier took a hit, was worse. The weight of that choice settled in her chest. Not as panic, but as resolve. She rolled slightly to starboard, setting a course that would cut ahead of the lead hostile element. The black ocean stretched endlessly below, an unseen presence that carried both freedom and finality. There was no turning back now. The distance between her and the carrier was measured not just in miles, but in the decision she had made. Her gloved hand eased back on the stick to climb into the intercept path, the jet responding smoothly. The afterburner's glow faded as she throttled back, conserving fuel for the fight she knew was coming. Alone in the dark, with nothing but the radar sweep and the quiet hum of her cockpit, Elena Carter carried the certainty that the moment to act had belonged to her alone. No one would have seen it. But it was here, in the quiet space between decision and action, that the course of the night had changed. The radar scope bloomed with sharp, undeniable returns. 2 hostile fighters were directly ahead, holding steady on an intercept course. While the rest of the formation fanned outward in a wide arc, Elena Carter adjusted her heading a fraction to port, skimming just above the ocean's surface to use the low swells as a radar mask. The black water was invisible beneath her, but she could feel the subtle texture of it in the aircraft's ride. The faint turbulence as the wind bent over the waves. Her heads-up display cast a green glow across her visor. She flipped the master arm switch and selected an aim 120. The targeting cues lining up on the lead contact, the radar tone shifted from intermittent to solid. A confirmation lock. She checked her range, still outside optimal, but the speed of the closing distance left little time to linger. The first missile alert screamed in her headset, sharp and urgent. She banked hard right, pulling G's that pressed her into the seat, and dumped a burst of flares. The muffled thump of their release and the brief flare of orange light passed into her peripheral vision as the missile veered off, tracking heat instead of steel. She leveled, rolled back toward the fight, and caught the lead hostile in her sights again. The launch button gave a firm click under her thumb. The AIM 120 leapt from the rail with a flash, disappearing into the darkness. The HUD tracked its progress, counting down the seconds to impact. When the hit came, it was a distant, expanding flower of light. Fragments spinning down toward the water. One gone. The second fighter broke high and fast, trying to climb out of her radar cone. She followed, throttling up, the twin afterburner plumes cutting 2 white-hot scars into the night. The G-force strain pressed her deeper into the seat. Her breathing controlled and steady, she brought the Pipper over the target, but he was already pulling away, forcing her to weigh fuel burn against pursuit. For now, she let him go, angling back toward the expanding arc of the other hostiles. A burst of tracer fire crossed ahead of her, brilliant white needles stitching the darkness. She rolled inverted, dropped altitude again, and felt the horizon vanish as the ocean took up her entire forward view. In the absence of visible detail, she flew by instruments, trusting the numbers, the angles, and the training that made them second nature. She popped back up, using the swell line to mask her re-entry into the engagement zone. Another radar contact was crossing ahead. She tagged it, but before she could lock, a missile trail lit up from her 3 o'clock. She snapped into a brake turn, flares blooming behind her, and came out of it nose on to the shooter. The opportunity was too close to ignore. She lined up, fired, and saw the missile streak upward before diving into its target. The flash was bright against the black ocean, debris tumbling into the swells. For a moment, there was space, no immediate missile tones, no radar locks screaming in her ears. She took a deep breath, scanning the scope. The second fighter from her opening engagement was gone from radar, possibly retreating or repositioning. The others were further out, adjusting their approach. Relief was brief. The fight was still far from over, and she was the only barrier between those aircraft and the carrier group. She rolled her shoulders under the harness, settling her hands back on the controls. The radar sweep passed again. The next set of contacts already moving into range, she could feel the black ocean below, silent and cold, watching everything without judgment. In the dark, alone, she had no audience, no confirmation except the marks vanishing from her scope, but every move, every shot, was a conversation between instinct and training, a balance she had learned to trust. It was mastery built for moments exactly like this, when nothing but her skill and her will kept the line from breaking. The radar sweep rolled across the scope, its steady rhythm now joined by the slow, insistent beeping of her fuel warning tone. Combat Air Patrol was still minutes out. The main strike group was inbound, but low on fuel. Their comms clipped and tight with the urgency of pilots watching their gauges drop. Elena Carter adjusted her intercept course. Scanning for the next set of threats, 2 hostile fighters were closing from the northeast, their vectors steady and fast. She eased the throttles forward, careful not to overburn and drain what little she had left. The black ocean stretched below, unseen but always present, a reminder that one mistake could end not just the mission, but her life. The first hostile came in high, dropping into a firing position. She let him commit, holding her line until his angle overshot. Then she rolled hard, pulling into his 6 with the horizon tilting steeply in her canopy. The G's dug into her chest as she brought the pipper over him, squeezed the trigger, and felt the vibration of her M61 cannon through the stick. Muzzle flashes lit the cockpit, white sparks against the void. The rounds found their mark, shredding his tail before the aircraft disintegrated into the sea. The fuel tone chimed again, sharper now. As if reminding her that every maneuver carried a cost, the second fighter broke off for a wider turn, forcing her to decide whether to chase or conserve. She chose fuel, holding position, scanning for the broader threat. That decision paid off a moment later when the radar painted the final pincer element, moving in from the West 3 aircraft, angling to split her attention and push through to the carrier group. She dropped lower, almost skimming the swell tops. Using the water's contour to mask her approach, the heartbeat of the radar quickened with each sweep. She climbed sharply at the last second, surprising the lead aircraft and forcing it to break high. The formation scattered, their coordinated pincer dissolving into separate, cautious tracks. She chased one long enough to put a burst across his nose, not to kill, but to convince him the gap to the carrier was closed for good. Sweat pooled under her helmet, trickling down her temple. The faint crackle of the comms carried cap updates, their voices still too far away to be part of the fight. She steadied her breathing, rolling level and holding station between the scattered hostiles and the carrier. The ocean horizon was a dark, tilting line in the distance, her jet settling into a slow patrol pattern designed to hold as much fuel as possible while still presenting a threat. One of the scattered fighters tested her, swinging in from the edge of her radar cone. She gave him just enough turn to suggest a counterattack, and he broke off again. She didn't waste the ammo or the energy chasing him down. Her role now was not to win the fight outright, it was to deny the enemy any opening until the others arrived. The radar heartbeat slowed as the hostile tracks began to fade, their signatures pulling back toward the west. Cap calls grew louder in her headset, the carrier's defenders finally closing in. She kept her jet in position, her fuel state flashing low enough to trigger the final caution tone. Every instinct told her to head for the deck, but she stayed, eyes fixed on the scope, until the first friendly fighters swept past her, contrails barely visible in the dark. Only then did she key her mic, acknowledging their arrival and easing her throttle back for the turn home. The ocean below was still the same silent witness it had been all night, unmarked by the fight that had played out above it. She glanced once more at the fading radar contacts, the heartbeat slowing to calm as reinforcements took over. Sometimes victory wasn't about the number of kills or the applause waiting on deck. Sometimes it was simply about holding the line long enough for others to arrive and knowing that no one but you would remember how close it had come. The combat air patrol swept past her position in disciplined formation, their silhouettes cutting briefly against the faint glow of the horizon. The remaining hostile tracks on her radar peeled away, fading into the west until they were gone entirely. She felt the pressure in her chest ease up, though it was not relief in the celebratory sense, more the measured release that came when the job was no longer hers to hold alone. The radio brought the terse order to return to base, the voice neutral, without any inflection that might hint at what had just been avoided. She turned toward the carrier, throttling back. The reduced G-forces let her shoulders settle into the seat, the constant muscle tension of combat ebbing just enough for the fatigue to register. Her breathing slowed, matching the muted rhythm of the comms. The deck's position light was the first thing she saw, a steady pinpoint in the darkness that grew into a lattice of illumination as she closed the distance. Mist clung low over the water, and the floodlights on the carrier's island glowed softly through it. Diffused but steady, she ran through the landing checklist in the same precise cadence she always used, each step grounding her back into routine. Flaps set, hook down, gear locked. The deck filled her windscreen, the outline of parked jets lined in careful rows. She caught the three-wire clean, the tailhook grabbing with a jolt that ran through the fuselage, pulling the jet to a quick stop. The engine spooled down, the roar softening to a deep hum. Ground crew moved in immediately, chocks in place, chains securing the landing gear. She opened the canopy, the cool night air pushing in against the warm interior of her helmet. A few crew members glanced up at her but didn't speak, their focus already shifting to the next recovery. Her commanding officer passed within arm's reach, eyes fixed ahead, offering no sign that he knew what she had done out there. She climbed down the ladder, boots hitting the non-skid deck. A mechanic she recognized from the maintenance hangar stood by the wing, wrench in hand. He didn't smile or speak, just met her eyes for a second and gave a small depletion with hers. Deliberate nod. It was the only acknowledgement she would receive tonight, and it carried more weight than any formal word could have. Around them, work resumed as if the battle had been a brief interruption to the night's schedule. Another jet was already taxiing toward the catapult, and the hum of machinery and shouted hand signals filled the air. The deck lights glowed steady on the wet surface, reflecting faintly in the puddles formed by the ocean mist. She walked back toward the island, Helmet under her arm, the nod still fresh in her mind. Out here, recognition didn't come with speeches or salutes. It came in small moments that passed quickly, almost hidden in the flow of work. The ship moved on, the night continued, and the heroics stayed quiet, known only to those who had been watching closely enough to see them. The morning air on the flight deck carried the familiar mix of jet fuel, Zolt spray, and the steady hum of machinery coming to life. Elena Carter stod beside her A-18, helmet tucked under her arm, back on standby duty, as though the night before had been any other. The deck crew moved with practiced rhythm, shifting chocks, checking tie-down chains, fueling aircraft for the day cycle. Pale dawn light bled slowly into the eastern horizon, but out to the west, the ocean was still a deep, featureless black. In the ready room, a muted television cycled through the news. The segment on the previous night's engagement credited the swift response of the combat air patrol, the anchor's voice brisk and certain. There was no mention of the lone jet that had launched ahead of them, no acknowledgement of the minutes she had bought. No one in the room commented on the report. She had not expected them to. She sat at her desk and opened her logbook, 2 kills entered neatly on the page, each with date, weapon, and coordinates. The comment section remained blank. The margin as silent as she had been on the radio before she broke protocol. She closed the book, placed it in her flight bag, and returned to the deck. The carrier rolled gently with the swells, the black horizon stretching unbroken ahead, the deck lights, still faint in the lingering shadow of dawn, reflected once again in her visor when she lowered it. That glow was a constant marking both the boundary of safety and the point of departure into whatever the next call would bring. She moved through her pre-flight checks with the same deliberate cadence as always. Fuel topped off. Contrôle surfaces free. Armaments safed but ready. The tasks were muscle memory, unchanged by the events of the night before. Around here, the crew's shouts carried above the whine of engines spooling for launch. The rhythm of a machine that did not pause to take stock of the individual parts that kept it running. From the tower came a routine update for the evening strike package. The night cycle already on the schedule. She acknowledged her place in the rotation, her voice calm and steady over the comm. Her jet was positioned on the catapult, the harness straps secured across her shoulders. The ocean air was cool inside her helmet. Carrying the faint salt of spray blown over the bow, she rested her right hand lightly on the throttle, feeling the smooth arc of its travel. The night ahead would come as it always did, dark, unbroken, and filled with the unknown. Whether she launched into it or remained on standby was not hers to decide. But her readiness was out beyond the deck lights. The black ocean waited. She watched it without urgency, without expectation, knowing that service was less about the moments anyone saw and more about the quiet willingness to be ready when the call finally came.